So we'll now turn our attention to Julie. So Julie, I hope that you're there and you can hear us and you're all set. So once again, I'm just going to read to you a little bit of background about Julie before we very soon get started. So Julie's the acting manager of Access and Engagement and is the project lead for the First Nations First program at Queensland State Archives. So I'm just joining the dots because I think that means Julie works with Rose Barracliff. So yeah, hi Rose. So I think we'll be possibly hearing a little bit more about that program this evening. So it's really great for you all to gain a bit of insight from Julie's perspective as another member in this quite groundbreaking work that QSA is embarked upon. With a background of more than 20 years in government policy, Julie's worked across industrial relations, water and government record-keeping portfolios. So that's noteworthy because we all need to recognise how these excellent, diverse skills our colleagues bring in to how our record-keeping community is quite broad. Our skill sets are quite broad, and that makes us stronger, not weaker, in my opinion. Since February 21, Julie has played a key role in managing and shaping the multiple projects involved in the First Nations First program, including QSA's cultural and internal change and making QSA a safe and welcoming space for Indigenous people. So really looking forward to hearing Julie's talk. So without further ado, I will bring up the right slides and just get that into the right view. Okay. So hopefully Julie's there with us.
I am.
Ah, fantastic.
Thanks,
I can't see you, but you can probably see me. So I'll sit down now. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Louise. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land in region, which I'm presenting from, the Cherbourg and Yagara peoples, and the traditional custodians of the land on which this conference is being held in person, the Ngunnawal people. I pay my respect to elders past and present, and I recognise their continuing role as knowledge keepers in relation to their traditional country. I also extend that respect to all First Nations people joining us today. So thank you for joining me today. I'm talking about our first steps on the path to treaty. We've been doing work on our First Nations First strategy for about 2 years, and we're really excited to talk about it. Next slide. So where did we start from? We started with a couple of seeds, essentially. We became aware that Blackfella Films and Rachel Perkins were working on the Australian Wars documentary series. You may be aware that that played recently on SBS. And David Patterson in our Access and Engagement team made contact and kept in touch with Rachel as they were preparing the documentary series because we wanted to see if we could work in partnership with them. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. They were also interested in the records we held at Queensland State Archives in terms of Australian wars. The second big thing that I'm sure most of you in the room are aware of is the Tandanya Adelaide Declaration. So on the 25th of October in 2019, the International Council on Archives and NAA held the first Indigenous Summit, See Us, Hear Us, Walk With Us, Challenging and Decolonising the Archives, led by ICA's new expert group on Indigenous matters. And that was held in Adelaide. The EGIM presented the Tandanya Adelaide Declaration, and it was the first International Archives Declaration on Indigenous peoples and access. It was presented to David Fricker, and basically it's a call to action for archives in Australia to adopt the themes in the declaration. So to quote from the declaration, it's about responsibility to reimagine the meaning of archives as an engaging model of social memory, to embrace the Indigenous worldviews and methods of creating, sharing and preserving valued knowledge, to decolonise our archival principles with Indigenous knowledge methods, to open the meaning of public archives to Indigenous interpretations, the remodelling of traditional archival principles. And the result will be a new model of public archives as an ethical space of encounter, respect, negotiation, and collaboration without the dominance of judgment, of distance, and enveloping authority. So the declaration was signed by all attendees, including QSA. Next page. I have to say we were really lucky. The stars truly aligned for us. So when that happened, the Queensland Government was working on paths to treaty. And you may be aware that on the 16th of August this year, the Queensland Government announced its response to the Treaty Advancement Committee report and indicated that there'd be some structures established in legislation for paths to treaty, that there would be a First Nations Treaty Institute to be led by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and we'll develop a treaty-making framework for the agreement with government and to make sure there was an equal voice at the table. The other structure that's being established is a truth-telling and healing inquiry. So at the moment, there's an independent interim body, IIB we call it, consisting of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders, as well as non-Indigenous representatives. And that's going to be in place for about 12 to 18 months while the legislation's being developed. And the IIB is going to lead local truth-telling initiatives. And one of those includes working with public libraries, museums, archives, and art galleries to promote a shared understanding and why it's important to know our history. Once the local truth-telling's done, then the formal 3-year truth-telling and healing inquiry starts. And the government's going to establish a path to treaty office, and that's to make sure the government's ready to come to the negotiating table as well. The Premier signed a statement of commitment with First Nation leaders about this initiative. And I think there's a really good sentence that demonstrates the work and things that are going towards this. And it says, this path to treaty is a journey, not for the timid, but for those who are courageous to confront our uncomfortable past, the curious who long to find out and live with the truth, and the optimists who dream of possibilities of a future where we live comfortably with the past, free of blame and rancour. Because we're working on the path to treaty, it's obviously a government priority, and so agencies are undertaking work to get ready for truth-telling and healing. The Premier's supportive. Our Minister, the Minister for Communities and Housing, Minister for Digital Economy and Minister for the Arts is the Honourable Leanne Enoch, and she's a Quandamooka woman from North Stradbroke, so she is very supportive and there's broader ministerial support. It's flowed down to departmental priorities, so it's part of our priority. And we've also, now in our department, we have a new First Nations strategy unit. It links to the Olympics 2032, which some people might think, how does it link to the Olympics? Basically, Brisbane 2032 legacy plan. So it's taking a look at how do we take advantage of the Olympic and the Paralympic Games platform in the 10 years before and the 10 years after the Games to try and drive economic, social, cultural and environment opportunities that have lasting benefits. So one of those includes First Nations culture as a priority. And they'll have a forum next year to help develop that. And then, of course, I'm sure you're aware of the national conversation about voice happening. Next slide. What objectives do we have for our work in the First Nations First strategy? So essentially, a big one is to contribute to the path to treaty. So we want to help with the truth-telling and healing and to let Queenslanders know generally about our history and how painful it is, to show those records that help support and show what really happened back then, obviously from one point of view. Our second objective, next slide, is about supporting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander self-determination, and that links to the Tandanya Adelaide Declaration as well. Next slide. Objective 3 is about looking internally at ourselves, and it's about improving our cultural capability and about making sure that it's safe for people to come here and visit and talk to us. Next slide. The 4th objective is again linked to Tandanya, and it's about having more of those inclusive practices to welcome and include First Nations worldviews and to become a comprehensive record for Queensland. So obviously at the moment we're a government archive, so all our records are made by public authorities or they're received by public authorities. So that would be a big change for us. Next slides. So what did we do first? Our first steps were to launch a statement of intent. So our minister launched the statement of intent in June last year. And that was to show that we had a new approach to sharing and valuing the historical knowledge of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It was our real first public step. So we were really excited about that, and it just shows our commitment to First Nations worldviews and to the Path to Treaty commitments. Next slide. Some other first steps we took is we were lucky enough to have Rose Barraclough, hello Rose, appointed as our First Nations Archives Advisor. So we really had no one that we felt that we could get advice on about our program and what we'd propose and how to finesse it and improve it and how to connect to others, things like that. So it was really handy having Rose. So we had Rose for 1 year and we've just recently reappointed her for this next financial year. We also had Dr. Jonathan Richards research some of our First War records. So we sometimes refer to First Wars the same as Australian Wars. So he did a lot of research up to about 1920, which was a lot of work trying to find those records, and he did a fabulous job. I'll talk more about that later. We also, once we identified those, digitised those records. We also engaged Des Crump, some people might know, as our First Nations language expert, and we did some cultural training for our staff. I'll talk more about those throughout the presentation. Next slide. We had just recently a big event for us. I'll talk in more detail shortly, but it was the Australian Wars, Evidence from Queensland Using the Collection for Truth-Telling. And that was our link back to Blackfella Films and Rachel Perkins for the Australian Wars. So we're really lucky to have a really good partnership. David set that up really well so that we ended up linking with them on a recording that I'll talk about shortly. Next slide. So we also have Judy Watson's skeleton exhibition. We are really happy to be having that. It basically opens the closet doors to Australian skeletons. It's about discovering buried evidence within state archives and bringing to light undisclosed happenings, validating the mistruth of terra nullius, colonial conflicts, and the continuation of Aboriginal resistance. So mainly skeletons refers to the physical remains of people, and it's symbolic of Black lives lost at the hands of the colony, both historically and in contemporary times. So part of those artworks are video works as well, which is really interesting. So, and they're presented alongside her raw, unframed, unstretched textile works that directly reference research from the archives. And basically her artworks are an exploration of the controverted histories that provide moments of recognitions for First Nation peoples and acknowledge their hardship, resistance, spirit and continued sovereignty. One of her artworks, called The Preponderance of Aboriginal Blood, has actually been at the Tate Museum in London for 12 months until July this year, so we are super lucky to have that one. And Shadow Bones has also captured the attention of the New York Times, and Judy's recently done an interview with them about that. We had Amanda Heyman from Blacklash Creative. She was the curator for the exhibition, and we've got some things coming out that people will be able to see. So we hosted an artists and curators yarn with Judy Watson and Amanda, facilitated by Camilla Ray and Kuma radio host Bo Spirum. And that should be available on our Facebook and YouTube channel soon. And we also recorded a tour with Judy and Amanda of the artworks that will be released soon. And that was really interesting to hear directly from the artist's voice about what each piece of artwork meant. For those in Queensland, we're also looking at expressions of interest to show the exhibition elsewhere in Queensland. So if you're from Queensland and you'd like to show the exhibition, just email us at programs@archives.qld.gov.au. Next slide. One of the major projects within the program is the Languages Project. So the pictures you can see there are David Patterson and Des Crump. They're working with Cherbourg State School to share Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander language resources with the school and members of Cherbourg's language and cultural program. So essentially we're trying to find records in our collection that show some of the language, and then the school is, not just from this resource but from other resources, teaching the children at the school the language. So it's really beautiful. We're also piloting a First Nations language shop. We did our first one this year with 17 participants, and that represented 20 language groups from across the whole state. We essentially sort of flew people down here to the archives and supported them with research and how to find records. And they found records that they weren't expecting, because you probably already know with archives, you don't know what treasures you're going to find. And it was really, really exciting to see what they found and how excited they were. We're doing another languages project, another languages workshop in March next year. But if you're interested in that, David Patterson from QSA is presenting on the languages project tomorrow in the developing practices theme. Learning Through Language, a case study of QSA's Indigenous Languages project. So I'd encourage you to go to that session. Next slide. I mentioned before that we're looking at cultural change at QSA. So some of that is about us actually changing ourselves. And we've been doing some training, and it's all staff regardless of what level you are. But it's more than training. It's really about changing the attitudes of people, because from the training that we provide, it's called Building on the Strengths of Our Stories, run by the Department of Resources. It's about understanding what happened in Queensland and the control the Queensland government had, and the role they played and what impact that had long term. And you're hearing from people who've been impacted by that. And not only that, but the training actually links to the records held at the archives. So it's really, really useful. It's a 2-day program, and it really highlighted to me how little awareness we have about what's happened in history. Until I went to that training, I didn't know the depth of the issues. So to make our workplace safer, we are trying to also provide a safe place for First Nations people to visit. We're also looking at trauma training, because some of the records that you find in the archives about the frontier or the First Wars are really harrowing and awful and painful. So if you were looking at that a lot, there's a potential impact on staff as well, let alone the people, the community coming in and having a look at those records. We're also trying to look at how we attract Indigenous staff. We're a small organisation. We have a staff of about 70 people, so it's not a big organisation. And 2 years ago, we had no Indigenous staff at all. We were lucky enough to have a First Nations trainee, William, And this year we were able to offer him a permanent placement with us in the digitisation team. So we've made one step. We have one Indigenous staff member. Ideally, we would love to have an Indigenous archivist, and that is something that we're looking at longer term and looking at how would we go about that. It's more likely to be a position that you grow yourself rather than going out and finding an Indigenous archivist, because archivists are hard to find at the best of times, so an Indigenous archivist will be harder to find. We still have a long way to go, but we've made some progress. We're also looking at how do we make QSA a safe place. So we've got a big public area, we've got a reading room. So what we did was we got a cultural audit of our public spaces. So we got Blackbash Creative in, and they came in and looked, and they've prepared a report for us to say some ideas about how we could make it more comfortable and welcoming. We also, at the same time, had an audit by Dementia Australia for the same reason about how do we make that a safe place for people with dementia, because we have a memory lounge where people with dementia can come in, and it's a program where we take them through images that might trigger memories, and they talk about it. So we need to make sure, what do we need to have here to make our workplace safe for them? So we're looking at both of those and how we could implement those report recommendations. One thing we've done already is we're a government building, so we have to have security. We used to have a security guard in a very prominent part of our foyer, and we've been lucky enough to be able to move him so it's less prominent and less intimidating for our visitors. So that's been our first step. Next slide. Metadata and access. So they are two really big critical elements for an archive, because we all know to find records we need good metadata. And essentially, for the metadata, we have whatever was transferred to us at the time. So, for instance, I know Rose has looked up the term butcher because she's a butcher woman. And so right now, if you went into our archive search and looked that up, you'd find a total of 5 records, which isn't good. So, you need to know what you're looking for to find it. And that's all right for the historians, and even it's a hard job for them. But for non-researchers and the community, it's not easy. So the metadata we have that was created back then is very basic. And sometimes even the records are basic and it might just have one name, like Fred. So we have to look at, what do we do about it? And it is one of those things that takes time. It's a big project. We have a lot of records here that we would need to go through to improve the metadata. And we do have a project on that. So we're looking at improvement of identification of First Nation records using IATSIS headings and Auslan codes for language. That project is in its infancy and is a long-term project. Next slide. So what have our achievements to date been? Has been a fabulous achievement. She provides advice to us. She provides reports, gives ideas on what we should do or how we should change what we're doing, not just internal practices, but beyond that. And she connects us with others. So she makes connections with other state government agencies and even outside the government, and even with Path to Treaty as well. She advocates for the archives, so including about how we can use these records for truth-telling and for Indigenous self-determination. She increases the awareness out there of the work we're doing. So she does lots of interviews with ABC, recorded interviews on different events for us, which we really appreciate. And I'm sure you all know that Rose is doing the Loris Williams Memorial Lecture this year, so that would be great. Next slide. So some of our other achievements. So we've been building relationships and partnerships. I mentioned Blackfella Films and Rachel Perkins and SBS. So essentially, Rachel was working on the Australian War series. We started our research. Dr. Jonathan Richards did a whole heap of research for us. So he's been doing that research for a few years. It's a passion for him. And again, it's not easy to find those records. He's actually identified 3,950 records, which isn't an easy task because there's no index, there's not great metadata. You're looking, for example, at colonial secretary records in letterbooks. So we are really happy with those records, being able to identify those records. Those records have now been digitised, and we've started transcribing some of those. So we've transcribed about 260 records. With the transcription, I would say that's something that we're thinking of, how do we do? Because these are records, as I mentioned, that are can be quite awful to read what happened. Obviously, when they were writing at that point in time, these people sort of thought, the government bodies thought what they were writing was fine at that point in time, but when you're reading it, it can be quite traumatic. So we need to look at how we're going to do that transcription, because the records are all that sort of handwriting, which takes a lot of time and effort to focus on to read. And as I said before, the records that we hold are from one point of view. So they're records made by the government at one point in time. There's not records here made by First Nations people. They're about First Nations people. So it's not language that we'd use today, and it's not the views we'd have today, but it's the records we have and the colonial records. We have created an annotated list of 200 of the more significant records that Jonathan identified relating to Native police, and we've put those on our website. And Jonathan also wrote a 5,000-word essay on the First War records. We've now published the First War's webpage on our website, and that includes the resources that I've been talking about today. Because we do want to focus on that truth-telling, healing, and raising the awareness of Queenslanders. Now, we held on the 21st of August an Australian Wars panel event at the Judith Wright Centre in Brisbane, and we did that in partnership with Blackfella Films and SBS. So they had just were releasing their Australian War documentary series, and we filmed the panel. So the panel was hosted by Kerry O'Brien, and the members were Rose Barracliff, Rachel Perkins, we were lucky to get her as well, Judy Watson, our artist, and Dr. Jonathan Richards. So that was a great event, and it's been recorded, and it's actually available on SBS On Demand. So if you're interested in that, if you go to SBS On Demand and type in Australian Wars, that along with Rachel Perkins' series will come up. At our panel event, we're talking about Queensland specifically and some of the impacts of frontier violence and how hard it can be to find the records if you're not a historian. We've also, as I mentioned, installed the Skeletons exhibition, and that's on display at QSA here till the 11th of February next year. And in terms of the languages project, we're continuing work with Cherbourg State School, and we're going to have the second languages workshop in March next year. Next slide. So in terms of our next step, we're working with the Path to Treaty Office and the independent interim body on the truth-telling and healing. So we've got the records that we've digitised. We also want to help support agencies and the community to find the records they're interested in. Our focus has initially been on the First Wars, but there's many, many other topics that we can research if we have the resources. You might also be aware that we've had a review of our Public Records Act. So that was a 2002 Act. So it was great to have the independent review. The terms of reference included enabling the inclusion of First Nations people in decision-making about control and access of public records regarding First Nations people. So, and one of the discussion papers that we published to get a response in that independent review dealt with that issue. So on the 31st of August, the report by the Honourable Justice Byrne, AO-RFQ, who was the chair and supported by an expert panel, was handed over to the government. So the report's not been released yet because the Queensland government's currently developing its response to that report, but that is expected to be out later this year. So I can't give you any more information on what those potential amendments could be. We've got the languages workshop next year. We've got to do more work on that metadata improvement because discovery is important. We know that there's going to be lots of challenges because we've got to find the records in the first place to improve the metadata, and we can only work with what we've got as well. But access to records is a big issue, and I think it's been a big issue raised because in Queensland State Archives doesn't own the records in our custody. We are custodians. So any decisions about access to the records are made by the agency that transfers the records to us. So if it was, the Department of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Partnerships who transferred the records, then they set any restricted access periods. And if you, as a member of the community, wanted access to that record, then you need to request access through that agency and they make the decision. There is also RTI, right to information and information privacy, potential access, but the request to the agency is the first one. And some records hold lots of personal information about the lives of First Nations people here. Given there was so much government control of their lives, there are a lot of records, and a lot of those records are really personal and need to be managed sensitively. So, there's records there about asking permission to buy a dress, asking to spend what should be your own money, asking permission to marry someone or to go somewhere. So we need to balance the right to access with the right to privacy. And in our minds, we see this as a marathon rather than a sprint. We know it's a long-term project. We're also looking at our public space redesign, so taking into account the findings of those audits, looking at what physical changes or other changes do we need to make in our foyer and reading room to improve them, make them more friendly. The other thing we'd like to do is seek some more funding and resources. At the moment, the work we've been doing is within our current budget. We haven't had any extra money to do this, so extra money for things like metadata would be great. Next slide. So we have learned some lessons along the way. The images that you're seeing on the slides there are from the Brisbane Domestic Airport Concourse, where QSA installed a whole heap of images along the concourse. So it's a bit more welcoming, friendly, shows some of Queensland's history to visitors. And we were called out. And we were called out because essentially to avoid causing offence, we caused offence. So we didn't include any First Nations images originally in those photos because we didn't know which images to include and we didn't want to do something wrong. So ironically, because we didn't want to do something wrong, we did something wrong because we're afraid to ask. But now we know who to ask. We ask people like Rose, our First Nations strategy unit, and some connections we've got with community as well. But that's probably not going to be our last mistake. We're trying to do things and take action, so there probably will be more mistakes, but we'll learn along the way. And probably the other big things is to build relationships and talk to the community and those who have knowledge. So I mentioned we have our First Nations strategy unit that we're linking to Path to Treaty. We've reconnected with Kyabra, which is our local neighbourhood centre. We have Rose and Uncle Des Crump We've connected with Blacklash Creative to get specialist expertise on the audit and the artist display, local elders and other agencies, so community and personal histories in the Department of Senior Disability Services and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Partnerships. They deal with requests for access to First Nations records held at QSA that they are responsible for, and we've been really working with them even more than we have historically to improve access and metadata and things like that. And also to connect to those already doing the work. So I mentioned Cherbourg State School, and when we did a Facebook post on that languages projects, we had other schools pop out and say, oh, we'd be interested in that, we'd be interested. So it's been a really interesting journey, but I think it's also highlighted the big issue about taking the time to build those relationships and talk to people. Next slide. So essentially my second last slide, and that is just to take the first step. Be brave, take the first step. Be aware you might make mistakes, but if you don't do anything, then that's the other risk. Last slide. And that's the end with my contact details. Thank you.
Questions. So I don't think you'll have trouble recapping on what we've heard. We heard from Angela about our anti-racist archival description options, and we've heard from Daniel about these issues around this personal, official personal records space. So questions from the floor. Anyone got a burning question they've been sitting on for the whole time? Yes, fantastic. So we will then take a question from someone in virtual land. If you'd just like to say your name, that's really helpful, because some of us will know you, but some of us won't. Hi.
Hi, my name's Kate. I work at Public Record Office Victoria. I have a question about the challenge for professional archivists around the idea of changing titles, because my understanding of the importance of transcription was to transcribe records as they were created, regardless of the current use of language or how offensive the language was. One to create metadata for discovery online, which is how search works now, and because historians may associate certain words with certain periods of time. And then your suggestion of changing the title, and whether there's a conflict or how you can get around that challenge.
Yeah, there's definitely a conflict because we do want, the original context of the record to still be there. I guess I would probably say there's room for changing the title on a front interface and having the original titling or the original description maybe just a bit further below, where doesn't pop up when people search necessarily, but it's still searchable. So maybe, that's obviously not all systems are going to allow for that kind of search, but maybe thinking about ways that we can use, like what traditionally, square brackets or things like that, to make it a bit safer for people to search, and just trying to think about getting around those things in those ways. So looking for just like multiple plural kind of descriptions and titling that we can do. Yeah.
Thank you. No, as you wish. So do we have a question from the digital? We do.
On? Yep. So we've just got one from David H. He's asked, by moderating the archival description language to make accessibility more safe and respectful, how is the viewer prepared to view the archival material when they see it?
Can you say? I don't really understand the question. Can you say it again?
Yeah. Okay. By moderating the archival descriptive language to make accessibility more safe and respectful, how is the viewer prepared to view the archival material when they see it?
Okay, so do they get any prep? Do they get to know your process?
The viewer, sure, yeah.
I think we're interpreting that to mean you're asking about the process, David.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'll just answer it like that anyway. But, I guess that's exactly where that accountability and transparency in description comes in. So, talking about who does a description is really important. I guess in terms of if there's any preparation for the viewer, I guess that just comes back to accountability for the archivist. I hope that answers the question. Sorry, it's probably,
Yeah, I think it does. I think that's, someone else from the floor might want to chime in to clarify that question. Does anyone else on the floor have another question? Yep, fantastic. Here comes Althea.
Hi, Tim Roberts from the Australian War Memorial. A question for Daniel about access restrictions to the PM papers. I was just wondering, along as well as all the kinds of restrictions you sort of mentioned in your talk, did you come across any examples of how they may have changed their decision making for personal papers that included that during a time when they were PM when Australia was at war, like international military operations? John Howard was in a few when he was in PM. I was wondering if that had become a new kind of restriction that came up in your research.
In my research, no, because of the type of material that I'm after, which is letters from members of the public to Howard and briefs about the contents of the letters. But as I request access, there are a lot of the times that individual documents are withheld for national security reasons, and based on the title or the time, you can sometimes guess that they are to do with Afghanistan, 9/11, East Timor, but I couldn't comment on that.
And have we got another one from the virtual realm? No. Okay. So, folks, it's quite good that we've stunned you with our brilliance, because it's actually afternoon tea. So just checking that no one else is sitting on a burning question, because sometimes it takes a while for these to percolate. Yes, there is. I knew there would be. That's great.
G'day, I'm Lewis Hinch from the National Film and Sound Archive. I've got a question for Daniel. Hey.
That's great. We're moving
in terms of, I guess I'm just trying to figure out where Australia sort of sits as whether or not we are more open or more enclosed in terms of transparency. Like, how would we compare? Like, I know in some countries you can telepathically make some of these documents secure. I don't think we're that advanced yet, but are there examples in other countries you think we should follow or ones we should avoid?
Broadly, and we're doing some work on this with a colleague in the history department, the US up until the 1960s regarded all presidential records as the personal property of the president, which meant the president could take them with him and do with as he saw fit. The passing of the Presidential Records Act, I can't think of the year, changed that to say that all presidential records belongs to the people. And I think one of the benefits of the extended transition time in America is that you do have the space, the NARA, National Archives and Records Administration, to go into the White House and secure documents before they're shredded and put down the toilet, hypothetically speaking. And I think the very quick transition time in Australia, which has benefits, does mean that you have to pack up quickly, as you saw that photo in boxes, and deal with things after the fact. And the archives often get the material from the former PMs many, many years afterwards. So we don't know what happens in that time. On the other hand, in the UK, there is a lot more of a process. And I think that is in part because there are more public servants in number 10 to enable a smoother record-keeping process. So I think there's some work that could go into looking at the way the UK runs their processes.
Thank you.
So I just want to conclude by giving our speakers a really hearty thank you. And Julie, thank you very much. Okay, so our afternoon tea awaits. So I'm really sorry. It's always a